Welcome to the Nick Bryant podcast. Today, my guest is Michael Cadella. He was a New York City cop for 20 years. He worked and supervised in the DEA, Secret Service Task Force, Special Fraud Squad, Missing Persons Squad, and Operation 8. Mike retired from the NYPD in 2003 as a detective sergeant. He now divides his time between TV and film work, being a professional fight trainer and running a Renzo Gracie Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu academy with his family. Mike is the author of Alphaville, Crime, Punishment, and the Battle for New York City Lower East Side. Alphaville has been described as a riveting, no-holds-barred memoir with the blistering narrative of the French Connection, the insights of a seasoned insider, and the relentless voice that reads like the city's own. Alphaville is at once a story of a dedicated New York cop and of New York City itself. How you doing today, Mike?
I'm good. Thank you for having me on.
You've you've been quite the superhero when it comes to NYPD. I mean, they should give you a cape. All the things that you've taken on.
Yeah. Yeah, not really. I just got lucky. I had a pretty fortunate career, I guess.
When I first moved to New York City in 1979, I was a kid out of Minnesota, and I was walking along the Lower East Side, and I realized that it was very different than Minnesota. And I was kind of stunned at there was like open air drug emporiums on the Lower East Side. And I ultimately talked to a cop. I said, why does this go on? And he goes, well, there were so many arrests last year for drugs that our courts can't handle them all. So tell us what it was like in Alphabet City in the 80s.
Well, basically, the city confined the drugs to a certain area, which was Alphabet City, because it had been a heroin haven for a long time. So I think the way the city looked at it was, we'll contain it. People will get their heroin down here, Lower East Side. Um, it was an impoverished neighborhood as it was, and people would come from all over the city and basically get their heroin down there. They'd actually, you'd see lines of people, 20, 30 people standing in an orderly line, waiting with their money out, as if they were on a cheese line, and they'd go up to the dealer and get, and it was blatant. It was out in the open. It was a tough existence for the law-abiding people that lived in that area.
Yeah, I'd heard that there were lines that stretched like a block for people buying heroin.
One of my first arrests in uniform down on Lower East Side. I worked in Coney Island a couple of months prior, but when I got there in uniform, I was literally in uniform. I took my hat off and I stood in line. Nobody even paid attention to me. I was in the back of a line of not that many people, maybe 8 or 10 people, and I made myself right up to the front of the line, right into the dealer. And I grabbed the dealer and I grabbed a couple of the guys buying, just like that. They were so intent and so focused on selling, like really quick. It's like a blackjack dealer, just shuffling and dealing and taking the money. They didn't even care that or notice that I was online. Neither did the drug addicts.
In the 80s, there was a huge influx of heroin from Sicily, the pizza connection. Is that where you traced a lot of the heroin to?
Most of the heroin down in the Lower East Side was because then later on I worked with the DEA. Most of it was Chinese heroin, straight from
Okay.
China, and China White it was called, and it would have different brands on it, like any other drug. They would stamp their dope, their big packages of heroin, and it was before TSA was established, and before people were actually frisked and really checked at airports. And one of the major Chinese heroin dealers that we locked up, I remember talking to him. He actually flipped and became an informant. But he had told me back then, this is going back to like 86, 87. He said any Chinese people you see driving nice cars or opening a business, he said they came over with a package, meaning they came over with a unit, or which is a little under a kilo, and they made, and so they cut the Chinese big dealer in China will give these people a couple of units to bring over. The people would come over, buy a house with the money, and then establish themselves, and they could be legitimate the rest of their lives, but they came over, and that's how they got like a step up, in society.
Was that heroin coming from the Golden Triangle?
Yeah,
That was made
a lot of it.
famous by Frank Lucas.
Yeah,
That's where he ostensibly went. Although American Gangster is filled with fictions. I mean, there
yeah,
was Chiang Kai-shek's army lost to Mao Zedong and the communists, and they established a little heroin enclave.
right.
And they're probably still pumping it out. I wouldn't be surprised.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised either.
So you had the nickname of Rambo and a $50,000 bounty on your head. Whoa. What's that like?
What happened was my partner and I were the dealers in Alphabet City ran freely for so long, and then my partner and I really started locking them up constantly and seizing their dope and seizing that we would call the feds. The feds would come and seize their vehicles, and we were doing such a number. I mean, they'd get arrested, be out in a couple of days. So it wasn't the actual arrest. I mean, that was annoying to them, but we take the material. We'd lock them up. They'd have a couple of $1,000s on them worth of heroin. We'd seize that. Like I said, we'd seize their vehicles. And the main guy, the head guy who ran the organization, him and a couple of the top guys got together, uh, and it was verified by somebody we knew actually told us about it, an informant. And what happened was Manhattan North was doing an investigation on a bank robbery pattern, and they had an informant they were interviewing with the FBI. And during the course of the interview regarding the bank robberies, the informant said, "Yeah, there's a hit on these two cops down in Alphabet City," and he gave our nicknames, and then so it was verified. Then they came and they told us, and they kind of transferred us. But we were doing such a number on these bad guys that they put a $50,000 contract on my head and also on my partner Jeff's head.
So I imagine you're a little more cautious at that point.
Yeah, well, they transferred us as a good meaning attempt to protect us for a short time. They gave us a radio, police radio to take home, and a different car to use, or a department car to use to go to and from. We weren't even up there a week, and we saw some of the guys from the Lower East Side had a spot up in Harlem. So they saw us up in Harlem. So, it didn't really matter. And then eventually the feds and the NYPD detectives got a hold of the guys that put the contract on us, who we knew, and they sat them down and they told them, "Look, this is the deal. We know about this. Nothing better happened to these two guys." And the contract was subsequently pulled off. And they were having a hard time actually having anybody secure the contract. Nobody wanted to hit two cops, basically.
That has a high mortality rate of murdering police officers.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the streets that you were cleaning up were run by Davey Blue Eyes. Tell us a
Right.
little about Davey Blue Eyes.
Well, he was in the service. He was in the Marines at some point. He went in young. He got out with an honorable discharge, and he came out. He had connections in the heroin business because his family was involved. He just basically picked up the mantle, and he was smarter than the other dealers, basically. And he had that. I guess he had that Marine mentality where he knew how to keep everybody in line. And he did. He kept everybody in line with violence. He eventually cooperates with the government, and he admitted to. So he had an accountant who worked for him, who was a drug addict, and he would keep the guy supplied in drugs as long as the guy kept his books correctly. So he admitted on the stand that he made $101,000 per day in heroin sales, and he himself was involved with 100 homicides. He personally um, killed 18 people. So he killed 18 people. His position was such that they would ask his permission to kill people. So he was involved with another 100 homicides. And he, like I said, he made $101,000 per day in his heroin organization.
And how long was he operational in Alphabet City?
Um, when I got there in like 86. So he was already a boss over there, and there were other guys that had spots, but he eventually just monopolizes everything. But, he like I said, he had the fear factor. People were afraid of him. He was ruthless. He was smart, and he ran, I would say, from the mid '80s to like '91. I think he gets arrested.
And what was his nationality? Was he Italian or?
No, he was. Some people say he was. Well, I know he was Puerto Rican. Some people say he was half Puerto Rican, half Italian. I don't know how true that is, but for the most part, I know for a fact he was at least half Puerto Rican.
At that point, was most of the heroin coming via the Italian mafia?
No, in
No.
fact, they didn't really use the mob at all. We went up in a wiretap at some point, and one of our targets, his girlfriend, said she had met somebody who was a wise guy or half a wise guy, and he had a heroin connection. And the our target yelled at her over the phone, basically saying, "We don't need to use the Italians. We got our guys. We got the Chinese. We don't need the Italians anymore." So most of the drugs was Chinese. And Lower East Side, as you know, is not far from Chinatown. So these guys had interactions with these. Now these drug dealers I'm talking about, they were young guys. They were my age at the time. They were in their early 20s, mid 20s, somewhere in their late teens. So they were young guys. The Chinese dealers, for the most part, were just like Chinese gang members that were into heroin. So that's where they got the Chinese would be able to have the heroin brought into the country. The Chinese gangsters would take it, pay them, like I said, for the transportation, and then they'd sell it to these Spanish guys down on the Lower East Side, Alphabet City.
So you and your partner were shot at, and there was some foot chases and some very close calls, from what I understand.
Yeah, we had a busy, like I said, Alphabet City was a crazy place. Most of the crimes eventually led back, like all roads lead to Rome. All crime led to heroin back there. So if it was a guy robbing, he'd be robbing to score dope for himself, or he'd rob a drug dealer, or a drug dealer would kill another drug dealer, or so most of the crimes, drugs were somehow involved.